Today you're going to need lots of colors to get our notes accomplished. You will definitely need blue and pink, and then also yellow and green. Blue and pink are the most important, but all colors will help us to understand our notes better. Today we're going to talk about multiplying fractions as scaling. So I'd like you to title your notes, Multiply Fractions as Scaling, please. Remember that you can pause at any time or slow down the video speed if you need to, if I'm going too fast for you. This video is a little bit of a long one. So when we're multiplying fractions, I want you to think, when I multiply fractions, will my product be greater, less than, or equal to the factors? So we're going to write, when I multiply fractions, will the product, or answer, when I multiply fractions, will the product be greater, less, or equal to the factors? When I multiply fractions, will the product be greater, less, or equal? And just a reminder, when we're talking about these, we can use the greater than, less than, or equal to symbols. We might not use these in this set of notes, but we will when we practice. Greater, less, or equal. Okay. Sorry, I just had to zoom in and zoom out again to try and get the page in the right place to write. So, part 1. There are 2 parts to talking about multiplying fractions as scaling. Part 1 is the most important part. This is the part I really want you to pay attention to and make sure you have written well in your notes. This is the 5th grade standard. So part 1, step 1. If, it's not really a step, it's a thinking process. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value less than 1, if we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value less than 1, then the product will be less than the whole number. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value less than 1, then the product will be less than the whole number. So I'm going to circle the words less in blue, and then we're going to look at an example. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value less than 1, then the product will be less than the whole number. So let's take a look at an example. We're going to multiply 5 and 2/3. So 5 is our whole number, and 2/3 is our fraction that is less than 1. Whenever the numerator is less than the denominator, the value of the fraction is less than 1. So 5 times 2/3. And we're going to take a look at what that equals. I'm going to do standard algorithm multiplication. I'm going to put my whole number over 1 and then multiply straight across. 5 times 2 is 10, and 1 times 3 is 3. I know that when I reduce that down to a mixed number, the value is 3 1/3. So 5 times 2/3 equals 3 1/3. 2/3 is less than 1. So 3 1/3 is less than the whole number we started with. It's less than 5. The number shrank. The product is smaller. Now, if we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value more than 1, or greater than 1, then the product will be more than the whole number. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value of more than 1, just neatening up my writing a little bit. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value more than 1, then the product or answer will be more than the whole number. The answer is going to increase. The number will get bigger. The answer will get bigger. That's a better way to say it. So I'm going to circle more in pink, more than 1, and then we'll look at an example. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value of more than 1, then the product will be more than the whole number. And we're going to use the whole number 5 again. And then we're going to multiply by 5/3. Now that fraction is more than 1. It's an improper fraction. It is more than 1 whole. I'm going to change my whole number into a fraction so I can multiply using standard algorithm. And then multiply across. 5 times 5 is 25. And 1 times 3 is 3. When I change that into a mixed number, the value is 8 1/3. Now, if you don't remember how to change between improper fractions and mixed number, it's a good idea to go back and review that skill. So my whole number was 5, and my product is 8 1/3. The fraction that I multiplied by is more than 1. 5/3 is more than 1 whole. And so the result is more than the whole number we started with. Now I'm sure you can guess what's coming next. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value equal to 1, then the product will be equal to the whole number. So we're seeing a pattern here. If we multiply a whole number and a fraction with a value of less than 1, the product will decrease. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value more than 1, the product will increase. And if we multiply a whole number by a fraction with a value equal to 1, the value of the product will be the same as the whole number we multiplied by. If we multiply a whole number by a fraction equal to 1, then the product will be equal to the whole number. So I'm going to circle the words equal with green, and then we'll look at an example. It's going to get a little squishy here at the bottom of the page. So I'm sticking with the whole number of 5. We're going to multiply 5 times 4/4. I'll change my whole number into an improper fraction so we can multiply using standard algorithm. And I'll multiply straight across. 5 times 4 is 20, and 1 times 4 is 4. Now, if you remember that fractions also represent division, 20 divided by 4 is 5. We can reduce that improper fraction to 5. So the fraction we multiplied by was equal. 4/4 is equal to 1. And then the whole number and the product were equal to each other. So that was part 1. It is the most important part. This is what your notes should look like right now. We're going to jump into part 2. And this is a little bit above 5th grade standard, but I think you can handle it and that it's important. Part 1 is the most important part. You do need to know that. But we're going to add a little bit here because we are deep thinkers. So I want you to think, when I multiply fractions, will the product be greater, less, or equal to? We're going to look at 3 other situations. And I'm going to shrink this down. I'm going to shrink this down, and if you hear me in the background, I'm switching around on my paper notes so I know what to say. So I want to tuck that in the back of our mind. Is our product going to be greater or less than the factors? So part 2. In part 1, we were talking about multiplying whole numbers and fractions together. In this section, we're going to talk about multiplying 2 fractions together. So if we multiply 2 fractions, that have a value less than 1, so they're both less than 1. If we multiply 2 fractions that have a value less than 1, then the product will be less than both factors. If we multiply 2 fractions that have a value less than 1, then the product will be less than both factors. Now, the reason why we're learning this is so that we can estimate answers before we start. When we multiply fractions as scaling, we're checking for reasonableness. We're using that to check for reasonableness, I should say. We talk about reasonableness a lot, and this will help us understand whether our answers make sense. So I'm highlighting less than 1. If we multiply 2 fractions that have a value less than 1, then the product will be less than both fractions, or both factors. So we're going to take a look at the example 1/3 times 2/5 equals 2/15. You know from standard algorithm that 1/3 times 2/5 is 2/15 because we multiply the numerators and then the denominators. And I'm going to show you this with the visual model so you understand that 2/15 is less than both 1/3 and 2/5. So I'm drawing boxes to represent my fractions. I've divided the first into thirds. I'm going to divide the second into fifths. And then I'll shade in 1/3. And then I'll shade 2/5. Now I'm going to shade 1/3 in, what color did I use? I cannot remember. I think it might be pink. Let's see. Yes, we're going to shade 1/3 in pink. Struggling a little bit with my pen there. Shading 1/3 in pink. And then we'll shade 2/5 in blue in a second, but I'm also going to shade 1/3 in the answer. Oops. Sometimes it does auto shape when I hold the pen down for too long. I'm not sure why it thought that was an oval. Okay, so I've shaded 1/3 in both the factor and the answer. And now I'm going to shade 2/5. And then I'll shade 2/5 in the answer. Now, if you remember when we multiply a fraction by a fraction, using a visual model, where they overlap, where they turn purple, that's the answer. That's 2/15. And you can see that 2/15 is less than both 1/3 and 2/5. It is smaller. It only takes up part of that rectangle that is less than both of the pink by itself and the blue by itself. Okay, so if we multiply two fractions that have a value more than 1, the product will be more than both fractions. If we multiply two fractions with a value more than 1, the product will have a value of more than both fractions. I'm sure you're seeing a pattern here. Good mathematicians find patterns. If we multiply two fractions that have a value of more than 1, then the product will be more than both fractions. I'm going to highlight more, and then we'll look at an example. So let's highlight more than 1 and more than both. And then we're going to multiply 4/3 and 5/6. 4/3 is slightly more than 1 whole, and 6/5 is also slightly more than 1 whole. When we multiply those using standard algorithm, we get 24/15. And I'm going to change that improper fraction into a mixed number, and it is 1 and 9/15. 1 and 9/15 is bigger than 4/3 and bigger than 6/5. All right, our last section is really interesting. If we multiply two fractions with one having a value less than 1 and one having a value more than 1, then the product is going to be in between the two numbers. So if we put them on a number line, it would be in between the two factors that we multiply together. Now this might be a little advanced for us to estimate, but that's okay. I just want to tuck the idea into your mind so when you move on to 6th grade math that it's there for you, or if you're ready for it now, you can begin to understand. If we multiply one fraction that is less than 1 by one fraction that is more than 1, the product will be in between the two. If we multiply one fraction that is less than 1 by one fraction that is more than 1, the product will be in between the two. So I'm going to multiply 1/3, which is less than 1, by 6/5, which is greater than 1, and the answer is 6/15. So 6/15 is greater than 1/3, but it is less than 6/5. 6/5 is more than 1 whole, and 6/15 is less than 1 whole. 1/3 would be 5/15. So 6/15 is a little bit bigger. I'm going to show you this really quickly using a bar model, a visual model of multiplication. I am going to represent 1/3 and then I'm going to represent 6/15, just to remind you that 6/15 is greater than 1/3. So I'm going to shade in 1/3 here on the box. This is not the full multiplication problem. I'm just comparing 1/3 and 6/15. So I'm going to shade in the 1/3 and then I'll shade in 1/3 first, but it's actually 6/15. So we get a little bit extra. It's just slightly more. So comparing 1/3 and 6/15, 6/15 is greater, but it's less than 6/5. So when we multiply, it's going to be in between the two. This is what your notes should look like. Now hopefully you found part 2 interesting, but remember part 1 is the most important part for us in our 5th grade learning right now. Thanks for watching. Come back and we'll do some practice and checking for reasonableness and seeing if we can estimate products when we multiply fractions.